What if we could love the way Jesus did? Passionately, faithfully, powerfully. What if the way we love could make a difference in the world around us? What if that love looked at everyone the way God does? A love which doesn't see the past, but is consumed by a desire to see people come to know Jesus. A love which is patient and kind, not envious or prideful. A love which puts others before ourselves, chooses peace over anger. A love which protects, trusts, hopes, perseveres. Do we love like this? Do we love like Jesus? Maybe it's time to ask a simple question. How can we love better?
Good morning. Let me add my happy Valentine's Day wishes to those that you've probably already heard. I hope you're having a great day. I hope you get to spend today with people that you love and care about and people that love and care about you. But we're very glad that you are starting off Valentine's Day here with us, whether you're here in person, whether you're joining us online. We're so glad that you're with us worshiping today. We're teaching through the book of Nehemiah. Here's something to think about. Don't you wish that in life we only had to deal with one problem at a time? Don't you wish they had to take a number? Like, I can't deal with you because I'm dealing with this problem. Just if there were some universal law that said you can only give people one problem at a time, wouldn't life be great? Because we know life isn't that way. Life tends to hand us problems in bunches, like 3 and 4 problems, 10 problems, all at the same time. Right? Sometimes it feels like life is looking at us and saying, oh, you can't figure out that problem. Let me give you 4 more problems to think about since you can't figure that one out. There's this compounding effect all of the time, problem after problem, multiple problems happening all at the same time. And the nature of kind of working through problems is often trying to solve one problem creates some other problems. Have you ever had that issue before? Okay, we solved that, but now that created 4 new problems that we didn't see coming. The law of unintended consequences is one example. Like you fixed it, but then the fix it created 2 more problems, and now you got to fix those. Life can seem like this constant race to solve problems, to fix things, to make things right, and they just multiply on each other, one right after the other. So we're studying through Nehemiah. We're in Nehemiah chapter 5 today, if you want to go ahead and find that spot in your Bible. But as we're studying through Nehemiah, he's leading this construction project. He's heard about the walls are down in Jerusalem. He goes back to Jerusalem. He's inspired everybody. He's challenged them to rebuild the wall. He's organized the rebuilding of the wall. We studied that a few weeks ago. He's been the administrator. Like, you're going to do that section, you're going to do that section, and you're going to do that section. So he's organizing this huge rebuild, but on top of that, he's having to deal with criticism from the outside, fear of attack, threats of attack from the outside, detractors. He's had to organize this warning system. He's got a trumpet player, and when the trumpet player blows the horn, they're all supposed to go to that part of the wall, and they're supposed to defend that part of the wall. He's got half the people working and half the people defending. Everybody's carrying a weapon. Nehemiah, if you read at the end of chapter 4, Nehemiah is sleeping in the same clothes every night just so that he will be ready in case something happens. There's problem after problem after problem, but what can be most discouraging about problems is not the problem itself or even the number of problems, but the the nature of the problem. Right? The number of problems is often less discouraging than the nature of the problems that we're having to solve. If it's a detail problem, we just solve the details, right? If it's a timing problem, we just fix the timing. If it's a logistics problem, we just fix the logistics. Some of you, that's all you do every day at your job. You show up and you just solve problems all day. And most of them are kind of timing, detail type of problems. That's one type of problem. The more discouraging and honestly the more exhausting type of problem is the people problem. Right? When the problem is not out there, or when the problem is not a thing, when the problem is a person, when the problem's coming from the inside, when the problem is on the team, that's a whole different problem than just fixing the logistics of a problem. This is Nehemiah chapter 5, and beginning in verse 1. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." In the midst of the debris, in the midst of the dust, in the midst of the sweat and the sore muscles and the concerns about attacks from the enemy, in the midst of all of that, there is a cry for justice. The need for justice never goes away. And that's because the ability of one group to take advantage of another group never goes away. The ability of a group with power to exploit a group without power never goes away. It's one of the most consistent themes throughout history. Drop into any point in history and you will find a group that has power that is exploiting a group that doesn't have power. That's the situation in Nehemiah chapter 5. There was a group in Jerusalem that was being exploited, and their suffering, their fatigue, their exhaustion, their cries finally rise up to the ears of Nehemiah. And that's a problem. We have a group in Jerusalem that's being exploited. The bigger problem, the more despicable aspect of the problem in Nehemiah chapter 5, what makes Nehemiah so angry in Nehemiah chapter 5 is it wasn't outsiders exploiting the people in Jerusalem. It wasn't the Samaritans that were taking advantage of Jewish people. It wasn't the Gentiles. It wasn't the Persians. The exploitation wasn't coming from out there. It was coming from within the family. It was coming from within the people. Right? Jews with power and wealth were exploiting other Jews who didn't have power and wealth. The whole country, the whole city, all of the people had committed themselves to this worthy goal. We're going to rebuild the wall. But in order to accomplish that, they had to neglect some of their regular work. Right? If we're going to focus on the wall all day, every day, that means whatever we were doing before then is not going to get done. We met some of them a few weeks ago. The perfume makers, right? They weren't making perfume while they're building the wall. The goldsmiths, they weren't refining gold while they're working on the wall. The merchants, they closed up their shop so they could work on the wall. The farmers were not tending the fields because everybody was in. Everybody was committed to this rebuild process, but they still had to eat, right? They still had to feed their family. They still had to survive. So here they are, sacrificing, committing to this project, but they're running out of money. To compound the problem in Nehemiah chapter 5. They were in the middle of a famine, which had been going on for years and years and years. So we already had a problem. We're already running out of food. We're already dividing between the haves and the have-nots. We're already in an emergency situation, and now we're not taking care of our normal needs because we've committed to this project. And we all know, in Nehemiah chapter 5, and any other time in human history, in times of crisis, in times of disaster, the people who live on the margins suffer first and suffer the worst. Anytime there's a crisis, anytime there's a disaster, the people who are teetering on the edge of poverty, people who are teetering on the margins of our society, whenever there's a crisis, they always suffer first, and they always suffer the worst. Their savings get depleted more quickly. They're less connected. They have less of a network of support that they can call on when crisis hits. And so typically, they suffer first and they suffer the worst. And they do their best to survive. Right? They do their best to kind of figure out how are we going to bridge the gap between where we are and where we have to get. How are we going to use our savings? How are we going to make the most of what we have? But when we get to Nehemiah chapter 5, the combination of years of famine and sacrificing for the good of the city and the good of the people, they've reached a breaking point, and they begin to cry out for justice. You can sense, when you read this chapter, you can sense their desperation. Just how desperate they've become. They say things like, we have a family to feed. We want to help. We want to be a part of this. We believe in what you're doing, Nehemiah. We had a family to feed. And we've mortgaged everything we can mortgage. We didn't come to you at the beginning of this problem. I'm saying we have tried to solve this every way that we could solve. We're having to borrow money just to feed our family. We're having to borrow money to pay the taxes back to the Persian government that they're implementing on us. We're not able to work our regular jobs because we're doing what you've asked us to do. And we no longer have the means to take care of our family. And this one, I don't know how fast it went by you when we read it, but this desperate cry from some of them, aren't our kids the same as their kids? Don't our kids deserve the same opportunities that their kids do? What makes their kids different from our kids? Why are our kids being sold into slavery? Our kids are just like their kids. Why are we being taken advantage of? And these are questions that leap out of 450 BC and travel 2,500 years down throughout history that we still ask today, right? Aren't we all the same? Doesn't everybody's kids deserve the same opportunities? Why do some kids face oppositions that other people's kids don't ever face? Why is there this injustice that is perpetrated? When you cut all of us, we bleed exactly the same. Aren't we all created in the image of God? These are the questions they're asking in Nehemiah chapter 5. These are the questions that there are places they need to be asked today. Aren't we the same? And if we are the same, why are we treated differently? Verse 6. It's Nehemiah speaking. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say, which is what you do when you get caught. They kept quiet because Nehemiah confronted them, and they knew they were caught. Think about Nehemiah's response. Nehemiah had an emotional reaction when one group of people took advantage of another group of people. He was angry, the Bible says. He was angry. When one group of people had the means to take advantage of another group of people. This is not a small issue to Nehemiah. He was angry. That passion we saw early on in Nehemiah, it gets funneled now into anger at the exploitation of people. When you and I, fast forward to our time, when you and I see people who've been taken advantage of, who've been mistreated, who are victims of injustice, the only right response is to get angry. The only right response is to say, this is not right. What you are doing is not right. We are all the same. Our kids are all the same. Notice something else. Nehemiah controlled his emotion before he addressed the problem. Just kind of a side leadership lesson here. The scripture says that he pondered these things in his mind. Right? He's angry. He's ready to go off on somebody. He's ready to launch. The Bible says he pulls back for a second, ponders this in his mind. He gets control of his emotion before he begins to speak, which is a great lesson. If you're in leadership, sometimes you need to pull back. You need to ponder things first before you just launch into saying. Probably none of us are perfect at that. I'm not perfect at that. Great example from Nehemiah. He's angry. He's ready to speak. He pulls back and says, let me get my thoughts together. Right? Before I say anything, let me think this through. And he basically says, what are you doing? What are you doing? Taking advantage of your own people. Then Nehemiah exposes the problem publicly. Nehemiah decides this is not a one-on-one. This is not a small group issue. This is a serious enough issue that we need to lay it out in public. We need to say this publicly. I don't know what that was. We need to say that was Siri. One can't know, okay. Siri's trying to preach the message today. That's awesome. Nehemiah decides, now we got to handle this one publicly. Not every issue needs to be handled publicly, but this particular one was big enough in Nehemiah's mind. This was threatening enough to the health and the well-being of the nation we need to talk about this publicly. And it was going to be uncomfortable. And there were going to be people who didn't like talking about that topic. And there were going to be people who didn't like being confronted with what they had done. And there were going to be people who felt like, well, you're not saying that we're that way, are you? You're not saying that we did that because we didn't do that. That was somebody else. He knew there was the potential for misunderstanding. There was potential for people getting sideways. There was potential for people to leave the church, all of that sort of thing. But Nehemiah knew this particular issue we need to speak about publicly. Injustice, taking advantage of, exploitation. We need to talk about that publicly. And so he makes a public address. And in doing that, his willingness to talk about this issue of injustice publicly meant Nehemiah gave a voice to those who were oppressed. He gave a voice. He allowed their complaints to be heard on a wide scale. He gave a voice to the oppressed. They've been talking about it for a long time amongst themselves. But chances are they had tried to get somebody else's attention before this. Chances are they had been saying, why are we treated this way and nobody else is before now? But now they had a leader who would not only hear them, but he would say, I'm going to use my voice for you. I'm going to use my voice to voice your side of this issue. Because in all of the rebuilding and in all of the debates and discussion, their voice never got above the decibel level where everybody could hear it. They were easily ignored. It was too easy to say, well, those people, they're always talking about that. It was too easy to dismiss them. But Nehemiah, because of his position, because of his power, his voice could amplify the voice of the oppressed. And we need to lend our voices to those who are oppressed in our world. We need to lend our position, the fact that people in our circles will listen to us when they might not listen to somebody else. We need to give voice to those who are the victims of injustice. Because here's the thing. People that run in your circle, people that run in my circle, there are a lot of people they can dismiss. There are a lot of people they've formed opinions about. They carry prejudices towards, and they're able to say, oh, it's just them talking. They're always talking about this. But if you said, you know what, I kind of see their point. I agree that things aren't always fair in our world. And they are specifically unfair to certain groups of people. If you said that to your group of friends, they would take notice. Same for me. They would take notice. We have the opportunity, when it comes to issues of justice and injustice and right and wrong, we have the opportunity to be the amplified voice of people who are often dismissed. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly what that looks like for you, because I don't know that that's my place. I'm not going to tell you exactly what that sounds like coming out of your mouth. But I read Nehemiah 5 and I look at this great leader, Nehemiah, who used his position and his power and the respect that people had for him to speak up for not just the wealthy and the affluent, not just for those who were in power, not just those who were politically persuasive. He lent his voice to the people who didn't have a voice. And things started to change. Things started to change. because he was willing to speak up. Now, I think one of the reasons he was willing to speak up, and one of the reasons he made this a public issue, is because this specific failure was a sin on repeat for the people. This issue of taking advantage of people, of oppressing people, this issue of injustice was a generational sin by this time. Like generations of Israelites had been guilty of this. I've told you before, you read the prophets, major prophets, minor prophets, they have two basic complaints against the nation. First complaint is the people had failed to worship the one true God, and they were worshiping other gods and other things in His place. Second complaint by the prophets, consistently through the major and minor prophets, they have failed to care for the oppressed. They have failed to care for the poor and the marginalized. They have failed to care for the foreigner and the immigrant. They have failed to honor God in the way that they cared for those living on the margins. Those are the two chief complaints of the prophets for generations. And here we are, we're staring at the same thing again. We're staring at people with power, taking advantage of people who don't have power. And Nehemiah says, "What are you doing?" He explains in verse 8, since he got there, he's been working to buy back enslaved Israelites from their enemies. Israelites who had either been captured or had been sold into slavery. Nehemiah says, look, one of the things we've been doing is we've been trying to get our people back. We've been freeing them from slavery. And then they get back here and you put your own people back in slavery. You sell them again and we have to go buy them again. What are you doing? How do you view people this way? They're right. Their kids are just like your kids. They are just like you. What are you doing? The Israelites, the Jewish people, they had created this system of perpetual poverty and enslavement. Perpetual poverty. The Old Testament allowed for indebtedness slavery. In other words, I owe you something. I don't have the money to pay you. I agree to work for you for so long to pay off that debt. The Mosaic Law, the Old Testament allowed for that to happen. Yes, you can work off what you owe somebody. The Old Testament does not allow, under any circumstances, for a perpetual cycle of poverty and indebtedness and enslavement. If you look back at verse 5, the people said, look, some of our kids are already enslaved. We can't get them out. We've had to mortgage everything we own. They are destined to always be in that situation. Perpetual, ongoing cycle of poverty. And it's like, not only that, the Old Testament commanded, this is in Deuteronomy 15, the Old Testament commanded that every 7 years debts were to be forgiven. Wiped out. You can go home. You don't owe me anything else. Deuteronomy 15. This was the command that God gave to Moses. Every 7 years, you forgive that stuff. We are not going to be a nation that creates perpetual cycles of poverty and enslavement. You forgive it every 7 years. What if they hadn't worked off all their debt? Didn't matter. You forgive it. What if I don't have any debt and they got forgiven debt, but I don't have any debt? How's that fair? Didn't matter. God didn't care about that. God cared about a system that would constantly keep people in poverty and enslavement and oppressed and victims of injustice. And God said, every 7 years, you got to wipe that out. You can't hold power over people in that way. Wealth and power cannot be demonstrated over people in that way. So here's what we know. We know they haven't been obeying that. And for these families to be crying out and saying, look, we haven't seen our kids in forever. We can't get our kids out. It tells you they had not been obeying what God had been telling them to do. And here's what we realize in Nehemiah chapter 5. The people of the nation, the people are being drawn right back into disobedience, even though they're standing in the rubble from the last disobedience. You know why the walls are down? You know why the nation of Israel got carried into captivity? You know why the nation got destroyed? And there were years and years of exile because they stopped worshiping God and they stopped caring for the poor. The very thing that destroyed them is what they've gone right back to start doing again. Ever been with someone like that? Like they're not even out of the last mess they made, and they're making a new mess that looks a lot like the last mess they made. And they won't listen to you to say, hey, this is the same mess you created last time. This is why Nehemiah is so angry with these people. This is what destroyed us in the first place. We didn't have a heart for the poor. We didn't care for the foreigner. We didn't have a heart for those who were victims of injustice. We didn't care about the marginalized. That is why God judged us the first time. And we're doing it again. What is wrong with you? And here's what we have to face in the world. In any point in history, including ours, in any place in the world, including the place where we live, power and greed are constant, subtle, but powerful temptations. They're just constant, and they're always going to be constant. Power and greed are constant temptations for any person, for any society. The tendency to misuse power. And you don't have to be rich to be greedy. And you don't have a lot of power to misuse power. You just have to have a little more power than somebody else. It's this constant threat. Verse 9. So I continued. What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? This isn't right. What you're doing is not right. I'm talking right and wrong, good and evil. What you're doing isn't right. And I tend to think Nehemiah is tying back into that identity issue. Remember, big issue of Nehemiah. We've lost our identity. We've forgotten we're God's people. And in some ways, I think Nehemiah is saying, this is not who we are. This is not how the people of God treat other people. We are created in the image of God. We belong to God. And when we see other people, we look at other people who are created in the image of God. This is not who we are. You ever walk out the door and go and hang out with some of your friends, and one of your parents says, don't forget who you are. Some version of it. Don't forget who you are. Don't forget what your last name is. Don't forget where you come from. When we forget who we are, when we forget our identity, when we forget who we belong to, it changes the way we behave. When we forget who we are, it changes how we behave. Nehemiah is saying, what are you doing? This is not who you are. This is not how we treat people. This is not how we view the world. We are the people of God. This is not right. We're reminded through this whole scene that the importance of the job never excuses the way we treat people. The importance of the job, because that's how we excuse it sometimes. The importance of the job never excuses the way we treat people, no matter what we're rebuilding or building. No matter how important this wall is, it does not excuse taking advantage of other people in order to get it done. The other thing Nehemiah is concerned about is, what kind of reflection to the world is this of our God, if this is the way we treat each other? If this is the way we treat the marginalized, if this is the way we view the poor, if this is the way we view victims of injustice, what is that saying to the rest of the world about our God? There's some debate over exactly what Nehemiah is saying in the next couple of verses, but the way I read it, Nehemiah is saying, look, me and my people, we're loaning food as well. We're loaning, but we're not charging interest. You need to stop charging interest. We're trying to get to the end of this goal. We're trying to help everybody get there. Stop making it more difficult to do what God has called us to do. During difficult times, during big challenges, there are two kinds of people. During difficult times, there's one group of people who step in and make things better, right? They step in and they help, and they step in and say, what do you need? How can I lighten the load? How can I make this season that's already difficult? How can I make this season easier? How can I play a part? That's one group of people. And then we all know the other group of people. When things are difficult, there's a group of people that step in and make it more difficult, right? They add more weight to the burden. They complicate things more. Nehemiah is saying, let's stop making this even more difficult. This is difficult for all of us. Let's stop making it more difficult. And here's what he commands them. He says, you got to give it all back. You got to give it all back. Give the land back. Give the vineyards back. Pay the interest back. Make restitution for what you took. Well, they signed an agreement. I know they signed it. Give it back. Well, it was legal. I don't care. Give it back. Stop taking advantage of your own people. We don't have time to read it all in the rest of chapter 5. But here's the lesson you get with the second half of chapter 5. Leaders go first when it comes to sacrifice and last when it comes to reward. If you want to be a leader, leaders go first when it comes to sacrifice. They go last when it comes to reward. Nehemiah's already said, look, we're loaning people. We're trying to get people through this. We're not charging interest. We're not taking advantage of people. We're trying to help people. Leaders go first when it comes to sacrifice. We realize in the second half of chapter 5 that Nehemiah was actually sent there in an official capacity by the king of Persia. He was made the governor over that area while he was there. So he has this official capacity. And in the second half of chapter 5, he begins to explain all the perks that he should be getting with that job. Well, I should have this much food. I should be able to feed this many people. I should have this much wine. This is what governors normally get. I haven't taken any of that. While you're taking advantage of each other, I haven't taken anything that I was supposed to get. He says, the guys before me, didn't they tax you? They enriched themselves by raising tax. I haven't done any of that. I'm here to help. Verse 15, he says, out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. I didn't treat you like that. Why are you treating other people like that? Verse 16, he said, I just came to help. I just came to build the wall. I thought we were doing this together. I just came to help. Leaders go first when it comes to sacrifice. They go last when it comes to reward. One more thought. Verse 19. He ends this chapter, he ends this moment with this word. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. All of his frustration, all of his anger, all of his disbelief that people would actually treat other people like this. People would take advantage of other people, and he's just unloaded for a whole chapter. Finally, he turns his heart back to God. He says, God, the end of the day, there's a whole lot of people that are mad at me now. Right? It's not just Sanballat that wants to kill me. There's probably some Jews now that want to kill me because I just took away their whole racketeering business that they had going. Like, I just stepped into that. I want to reaffirm before I walk away from this, God, the only thing I care about is what you think of me. Because at the end of the day, the end of the job, or at the end of your life, all that matters is what God thinks of us. As you and I may be hesitant at times to speak up about injustice, as you and I may be hesitant to speak up about the brokenness of the systems in our world because we're a little concerned about what people who are close to us might think. At the end of it all, the only thing that matters is what God thinks about what you say. And what God thinks about who you stand up for. And what God thinks about when you speak and how you use your voice. And there are right ways and wrongs. There are constructive ways and not so constructive ways to do this. I understand that. That's its own issue. But here's Nehemiah saying, I'm going to do what's right. And I'm going to speak against the powerful if they're taking advantage of the powerless. I'm going to speak against the oppressor, and I'm going to speak for the oppressed. I'm going to name injustices because at the end of the day, God, all I care about is what you think of me. And there are going to be times in your life, if there haven't been already, there are going to be times you need to speak up. You need to take a stand. You need to clarify. I'm actually on this side of that issue. I'm actually with them. And I love you, and you're my friends, and I respect you, and we can dialogue about this. But I feel like I need to clarify, I'm over here. Because over here is where justice is. This is where righteousness is. This is where good is. And I'm going to use my voice to say it. God, we live in conflicting times. It was 2,500 years ago that Nehemiah said to a group of people, this is not who we are. This is not right. We will not stand for one group taking advantage of another group. I will lift up my voice for the sake of the oppressed. God, show us how to do that in 2021. Show us where the words need to be spoken, where clarity needs to be brought on right and wrong, and remind us that at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is what you think. Not what our group thinks, not what our family thinks, not what the people that we've tried our whole life to impress think. It matters what you think, God. Make us bold. Give us clarity of vision to do what is right. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.